Hello, AP students. Welcome back from spring break. Um, I, I hate that kind of the week that we were covering World War II was, the first week in the crazy week of the school being closed for the coronavirus. Um, but I did want to try to give you some notes. So I do want you to get out your notebooks. I'm also going to be adding in questions on this presentation. And I want you to take down your notes just to be able to come back and review it. A lot of this stuff you may have answered or have thought about before, or maybe you already knew. But I do want us to, I do want to get us thinking about World War II, why it started, and how it impacted America, as well as just knowing kind of some key moments of the war. So I'm really going to begin with the kind of ideas that started the war. And the way I would do this in class much more dramatically is just to talk about the consequence of ideas. There's a great book by a political philosopher named Richard Weaver that wrote a book called Ideas Have Consequences. And, it's certainly true. The ideas of Marx became a reality in the Soviet Union and led to mass starvations in the Ukraine of millions of people. The ideas of Nietzsche and Darwin were embraced and modified by Hitler, and his own political ideas in Mein Kampf led to this massive German war machine that nearly conquered the world and did exterminate over 11 million people in the Holocaust and 6 million Jews. And so ideas don't just stay on paper. They go from minds to paper to hearts and to political systems, and they can change the world for good or for bad. And certainly in World War II, we see some terrible, terrible ideas on display, and the United States plays a really unique role in this. That's one thing that I think one reason that World War II captured so many imaginations is that the United States sort of has this grand moment of international um, kind of heroism where it is able to literally beat the bad guy, and it's something to be proud of as Americans. We're going to talk about totalitarianism, and we're talking about as you guys probably know, Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini. The one thing all these people had in common was that they were totalitarian. So even though Stalin became our ally, um, these are governments that had total control as much as possible of the lives of their citizens. In Stalin's Soviet Union, in the USSR, as you know, it's a communist regime. We're going to talk about that later this week as well. But total control of religion and trying to shut down churches and persecute believers and outlaw the Bible. Uh, Total control over people's property, where they could confiscate land and collectivize farms. Control of the press, control of the education system. And, this is a really modern thing. We think about kings of the Middle Ages or, some other time as having just crazy amounts of power. It's really 20th century leaders because of their use of technology and because of the modern militaries that they have at their disposal. It's really the 20th century leaders that are able to be totalitarian, that are able to gain unprecedented power over the lives of their citizens. And so in the 1920s, that is when, right after World War I or during World War I, there's a revolution in Russia. By the 1920s, well, Russia has become a communist empire, and under Stalin's leadership, it is the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and it is a regime where the Communist Party and Stalin and the head of that reigns supreme, and a regime that kills, murders millions of its citizens, and starves to death millions of peasants in order to try to industrialize. And we'll talk about this more later, but that is one example. So let's kind of go back. It is after World War One, before World War Two, and one option for how to do government is the very powerful Soviet Union and what they're doing there. And remember, it's the Great Depression, it's the 1930s, and government's not going well in just about any part of the world. And so people saw communist Russia as a possibility. Uh, the news of the famines in the Ukraine and things like that were not, very well known, and so people saw this as a possibility. Um, we have Benito Mussolini in Italy, and he's really the first to kind of outline the ideas of fascism and kind of define what it is. And so the Fascist Party was an Italian political party that called for a strong authoritarian leader. It's basically anti-democratic in the sense the power comes from the people, but the so it's democratic in that sense, but the leader is supreme, and there's not really debate and deliberation and representation. All that kind of stuff is, we know from our own history that there's just sometimes endless debates and waste of time and money. And Mussolini's basically saying, let's get rid of that and entrust one person with the power. And of course, that one person was him. Called for imperial expansion. We're talking about some details of that in a little bit. And called for a strong military. So this kind of national pride. One thing that I would have under fascism that I probably should have put in there is just this extreme nationalism. That the country is very much, in Mussolini's case, there should be pride in being Italian, and he's trying to restore this sort of sense of Italian pride, and even talk about how great Italy used to be, like back in the days of the Roman Empire, and restoring that sort of grandeur and glory. So one thing about fascism that if we try to understand the mentality, the kind of philosophy behind it, it sort of looks back to the past, looks back to kind of the glory of a civilization, and it basically says, things are not the way they should be now. At least this is how it comes on the scene. But we're going to try to restore that glory, restore a sense of pride, restore a sense of respectability. And Italy needed that, and certainly Germany needed that. We all know Hitler, his Nazi party in Germany, National Socialist Party, embraced basically the same ideas as Mussolini, but took them further. Right, a strong authoritarian leader. Hitler became the Führer in Germany. Imperial expansion, militarism, building up a big, large army, as well as, and I should have had this as number 4, and I hope you guys put that in your notes as a number 4, with both of these things, this extreme nationalism, right? And for Hitler, it was very much Germany for the Germans. Nationalism became a really big thing in 19th century Europe, if you remember from world history, and Germany was formed into a country. It hadn't been a country, and it was all the German-speaking people should have their own nation. And, it made sense to a lot of people that would be the case. But Hitler comes along and turns this into a very extreme form of nationalism to, it sounds okay, we're going to bring in Austria or whatever, and they speak German. Bring Austria in. Okay, that's nationalism. But then when you start doing things like killing the gypsies, which are a race of people, killing, obviously, the Jews, killing the Poles, the Polish people, this is, of course, this idea of Germany for the Germans going way too far. And even in Hitler's case, the need for what he called living space, or Lebensraum, the idea of needing to gain more land, like Poland, and turn it into for living space for the German people. And but it's this nationalistic impulses for the German people. Hey, so in theory, Stalin and communism was opposed to Hitler and Nazism. Hitler comes along in the 1930s, in the time of Germany is struggling economically, and he blames, people are afraid that communists might take over, the Reichstag, the German parliament, is burned down, and the he blames the communists for doing it, and so he really does take over because of fear of communism, fear that people would lose all their property, fear that the radicals would take over. Um, but in reality, what he had to offer was another form of totalitarianism, another form of one person having all the power. Lastly, we need to just touch on Japan a little bit. Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan, more of a figurehead than anything. Another name you could possibly know would be Hideki Tojo, um, head of the Navy, I believe, of Japan, and an admiral. Um, the Japan was militaristic and imperialistic. Not really the same kind of system as Europe, but you had a lot of similar things. You had them wanting to expand militarily, expand their control, and they wanted Japan to sort of be in the driver's seat in what was going on in Asia. And if you think about this in context, you'd had years of Europeans really controlling Asian commerce, even taking over lands like Indonesia, large parts of China, Philippines. The Philippines was American, so Japan kind of comes along and says, we're going to start building an empire, and it is going to be an Asian empire with us in charge of it. And that's kind of their mentality in this time. So all these things are going on at the same time. It's or nearly the same time between World War One and World War Two. So the 1920s and especially the 1930s, after the Great Depression, these powers begin to rise. And there's a reason why people look to totalitarian governments, because it seems like to many, many people that democracy has failed. When you have in Germany a 40% unemployment rate in the Weimar Republic after World War One, before Hitler comes along, it's not working. And in Germany, you have massive inflation. People's life savings, would buy a loaf of bread. Seems like democracy had failed, and so they look to a strong leader. They look to a government that can get things done. They look to a government that can create jobs for them, which is exactly what Americans did. They just didn't take it nearly as far. We talked about FDR is what happened in America during this time. And so in context, FDR is very tame, even though for American history, he was extremely radical. And I want you to begin thinking about this. I'm not going to outline everything. I'm actually going to put it in the form of a question for you guys to answer. And you guys can look this up. But fascist and communist are said to be opposites. Fascists are said to be to the right and communists to the left. I think probably the best way to understand this is to kind of do a Venn diagram and see that fascists are in some ways opposite of communists, but there's also a lot of common ground when it comes to totalitarianism. But sorry about that. But why are they seen as opposites? We talked about Hitler came to power because of a fear of communism. Mussolini did a similar thing, and Hitler saw Stalin as, he sort of admired him and all the power he had, but he also saw him as his enemy, at least ideologically his enemy. I think one of the things that's going on here, and I don't want to totally answer this question because I want you guys to think about their differences for yourself, but one of the things that's going on here is that for intellectuals all around Europe, they had given up on democracy. And that's the reality. If you're sitting in a Paris cafe, people were, in 1935, people are really talking about, should we be communist? Should we be fascist? And, they're arguing these things. And so many people had really given up any hope for democracy actually working. And that's just the sad reality of particularly Europe in the 1930s. Okay, so these are kind of the ideas and the leaderships and or the leaders and their governments that really get things started in World War. II. So let's move from that to sort of this pre-war timeline. Okay. Um, and just kind of the events, the major events that I would know if I were you. First of all, in 1935, Mussolini decides Italy needs an empire. And so they invade the one African country, or one of two African countries, that does not really have, or that doesn't have a European power over it. It's not colonized, and also Ethiopia has pretty much no military force, or no, they have an army, but they don't have much technology. They have like no airplanes, and Italy had built up a very modern air force in 1930s under Mussolini, and they just came in and bombed Ethiopia. They set up a pretext for war, saying one of their colonies, Somalia, was invaded, but it was just Mussolini's attempt to give the people what they wanted: a strong Italy, an Italy that had an empire, an Italy that won wars. This was what made him popular among the people, and so that's how he came to power, promising that sort of thing, and that's what people got. Um, I do want you to know the Spanish Civil War, at least a little bit. I know you guys wrote about this. The United States didn't help out the Republican side, the more democratic side of the Spanish Civil War. But in 1936 to 1939, the Spanish Civil War pits a Republican, democratic kind of government in Spain against a fascist leadership of Franco, who was a general in the Spanish army, and he tries to overthrow the more democratic army of Spain, and eventually does. But a couple other issues to this: that democratic government of Spain was pretty left leaning, and eventually becomes supported by the Soviet Union. And so it was kind of communist leaning, socialist leaning, and eventually supported by the Soviet Union. Franco's government is supported by Mussolini and by Hitler. Although Franco never comes to their aid in World War II, he is really put into power because of Mussolini and Hitler helping him out. And what you see in the Spanish Civil War is kind of like this microcosm of World War II. You have democratic people allying with socialist and communist against fascist. And with a different result this time, Franco, a fascist, wins the war. And in both cases, the United States really doesn't want to have anything to do with it. At least in World War II, we do get dragged into it. In 1937, Japan invades China. I probably should have put another date on this timeline because I don't have the year. I think it's 31 actually. I'm pretty sure it is 31. Japan invades Manchuria before they invaded China, and Manchuria was part of northern China, but in 37 they invade mainland China and go into Nanjing, China, and it's awful in a lot of ways. By 1937, World War II has begun. There's fighting in Spain going on, which I guess is not necessarily connected to World War II yet, but the building of a Japanese empire in Asia has begun in 1937. And so if you're looking at the Pacific theater and what's going on in the Pacific, World War II has begun. But most people date it to the invasion of Poland. In 38, Hitler begins to take over areas that are German-speaking. The Sudetenland is part of Czechoslovakia that's German-speaking. Austria is a German-speaking state, and Hitler begins to annex those. He does it peacefully, although he does bring his army in. There's just no war specifically, or battles specifically, but Hitler does annex Austria and the Sudetenland. You guys may know that the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain is famous for appeasing Hitler and basically saying, you can just take Austria, trying to avoid a war. He's giving Hitler what he wants, which is more and more land. And Chamberlain and the French as well, the British and the French, both of them allowed Hitler to break the Treaty of Versailles by taking over new land, allowed him to break the Treaty of Versailles by building up an air force, allowed him to break the treaty by putting troops in the Rhineland, which was near France. And all these things, Hitler trampled all over the Treaty of Versailles. But Chamberlain's idea is that, okay, well, we're going to avoid a war. That's really what we want. What they didn't know is they were just allowing Hitler to become stronger and allowing a war to be much, much worse than it would have been. Finally, in 1939, Hitler seizes all of Czechoslovakia, which wasn't even, German speaking. So this was not even a nationalistic thing. This was just wanting more control over more lands. Still, the powers of Europe do nothing and say, basically, if you keep on doing this, we will finally go to war, and give him an ultimatum. Also, by the 1939, there is a Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, which this is an alliance, and with between Hitler and Stalin, allowing, or basically saying that that they would not be fighting, and it really sets up Hitler's invasion of Poland. So in September of 1939, Hitler invades Poland, knowing that it's not going to be seen by the Soviet Union as trying to get to the Soviet Union or attack Russia. And even Russia goes into Poland and takes part of Poland after Hitler invades into Poland. The Soviet Union's come in on the eastern side of things and invade Poland as well. So Poland's caught in the middle, and it's pretty rough. So these are things that set up World War II. You have these great totalitarian powers just growing in power as the war, or at the beginning of the war. Let's just look at a little bit of the beginning of the war, and then I need to finish up this video so it won't be too long. I do want you to know the Blitzkrieg, the term Blitzkrieg, lightning war, which basically means that Germany went in with planes and with tanks, rapidly moving in. Their tanks would go way further and way faster than troops could march, and they got into Poland, and in weeks Poland was taken over by Germany, and so more land was conquered in a couple weeks of World War II than was ever done in 4 years of World War One. After the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war in Poland, there's a time where Britain declares war, France declares war, World War II is officially on, but they're kind of waiting for the next move to be made. Sorry. And it's called the phony war because nothing happens for a while. The United States does want to support Britain and France, and does so with the cash and carry policy, which basically makes them come get their own, if they want to buy goods, if they want to buy military supplies, munitions, they can come get them. They're not going to loan them money, and they're going to get them themselves. Okay. Again, I'm going to go through pretty quickly, but Hitler and the German army invade France in 1940. France falls quickly, almost as quickly as Poland. France had put all their military energies into the Maginot Line, which was a defensive line that Hitler was able to go past pretty quickly, and they were there to defend France, but once you got past that line, the French army was pretty much helpless. Gonna move on. I do want you to know the name Charles de Gaulle. It might be good to know, but I don't think you really need to know it for this class. Germany then goes in to invade Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and then finally starts bombing Britain. They also go in and take North Africa. And by 1941, let me just go back and say they were not able to conquer Britain, but they did begin trying to bomb them, getting ready to invade Britain. By 1941, and this is what we're going to end on, this is this is what a map of Europe looks like. It looks like the Soviet Union has a non-aggression pact with Germany, and Germany has conquered pretty much all of Europe except for Britain. It's really the only thing to stand in the way. You can't see it, but Germany has also taken most of North Africa as well, and taken over French colonies in North Africa, because France had control of a lot of North Africa, and so things are not looking good for basically Britain. Britain is the only country that's really standing up against Hitler and this massive amount of German conquest. And so World War One does not begin. I'm sorry, World War Two does not begin well for the Allies, because there really are no allies. It's Britain, because France falls pretty quickly, and the United States helps them with some supplies, but not very much, not enough to make much of a difference. Okay. Thank you for listening. We're gonna get into some other aspects of this and a little bit of military stuff, but also some kind of social stuff and some propaganda, with the next uh, the next video that I'm going to do on World War II. Thank you guys.